The Duke is laughing. The words moved through Whitmore Hall like a prayer no one dared say aloud. Emily Carter did not understand why every face around the long mahogany table had gone still, why the silver forks had stopped halfway to waiting mouths, or why the elderly butler near the doorway suddenly looked as though he had seen a ghost. She only knew that Ethan Whitmore, Duke of Whitmore, had lowered his head and covered his mouth with one hand while a deep, unwilling sound escaped him. It was unmistakably laughter. Not polite amusement, not the thin smile of a man enduring company. Real laughter, roughened by disuse, rising from somewhere so deeply buried that even he seemed startled by it. Emily stood beside the sideboard with a stack of household ledgers pressed against her plain gray dress, uncertain whether she had committed some terrible breach of etiquette. A moment earlier, Lady Beatrice Holloway had been complaining that the ancient portrait above the fireplace made her uncomfortable. The painted ancestor, Sir Reginald Whitmore, stared down at the room with narrow eyes and a mouth severe enough to frighten children. Emily, believing no one important was listening, had quietly remarked to the housekeeper that Sir Reginald looked like a man who had just discovered the furniture had opinions. She had not meant to be funny. She had certainly not meant for the Duke to hear. Yet now Ethan Whitmore was laughing, and the entire dining room had fallen into a silence so complete that the fire seemed suddenly loud. Lady Beatrice stared at him. The housekeeper pressed trembling fingers to her lips. Somewhere near the doors, a young footman nearly dropped a crystal glass. Emily glanced from one stunned face to another before finally looking at the Duke himself. Ethan sat at the head of the table in black evening clothes, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his posture usually as rigid as the stone walls surrounding them. Until tonight, Emily had known him only as a man of measured words and unreadable eyes, a man who seemed to carry winter with him even indoors. Now, for one impossible second, warmth transformed his face. He looked younger, human, almost happy. Then an older woman seated near the fireplace whispered, "Dear God, 10 years." The laughter stopped. Ethan's expression changed so quickly that Emily felt the room grow colder. His hand lowered. The color drained from his face. There was no embarrassment in his eyes. No anger. There was fear. Pure, startled fear, as though the sound that had escaped him belonged to someone dead. He pushed back his chair. "Excuse me." His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened against the table before he turned away. No one tried to stop him. The doors closed behind him, leaving the guests staring at the empty chair. Emily looked toward the housekeeper. "What happened?" she whispered. The older woman did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the doors through which the Duke had disappeared. At last she said, very softly, "No one has heard His Grace laugh since the winter his brother died." Emily looked again at the empty chair, and for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Hall, she understood that the silence in the house was not discipline. It was mourning. And somewhere beyond those closed doors, a man who had forgotten how to live had just remembered, for one terrifying moment, what it felt like. 3 weeks earlier, Emily Carter had arrived at Whitmore Hall beneath a sky the color of old pewter, carrying one worn suitcase, 2 carefully folded dresses, and a letter of employment she had read so many times the creases had begun to soften. The carriage left her at the foot of the broad stone steps just before dusk, and as she looked up at the immense gray house, she understood at once why the villagers had lowered their voices whenever they spoke of the place. Whitmore Hall was beautiful, but it did not feel welcoming. Its tall windows reflected the fading light without warmth. Ivy clung darkly to the eastern walls, and the carved stone figures above the entrance seemed to watch every visitor with solemn disapproval. Mrs. Whittaker, the housekeeper, met Emily inside with a ring of keys at her waist and an expression that suggested she had forgotten how to waste words. She led her through corridors lined with portraits, past a silent music room and a ballroom whose doors had been locked for years. The servants moved quietly. Even their shoes seemed to understand the rules of the house. "You will assist with the library records, correspondence, and household accounts when needed," Mrs. Whittaker explained. "You will speak respectfully, work carefully, and keep to the rooms assigned to you." Emily nodded. She had come to earn a living, not to become curious about wealthy strangers. After her father's death the previous spring, curiosity had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Still, as they climbed the main staircase, Mrs. Whitaker stopped so suddenly that Emily nearly walked into her. There are 3 things you should know about His Grace. Emily waited. Do not enter the West Wing unless you are instructed. Do not ask about his brother. And do not make light of laughter in his presence. Emily blinked. I was not planning to make light of laughter anywhere. Mrs. Whitaker stared at her for a moment, uncertain whether Emily was being insolent. Emily was not. That was simply how she spoke. See that you remember it, the housekeeper said. The first time Emily met Ethan Whitmore, she did not know who he was. She found him that evening in the library, standing before the fire with a letter in one hand. His black coat was plain, his posture severe, and his expression suggested the letter had personally disappointed him. Emily entered carrying a stack of books and stopped when she saw him blocking the shelf she needed. Excuse me, she said. He looked at her, but did not move. You are new. Yes. And you intend to rearrange those books? Only the ones that have been placed incorrectly. His gaze shifted toward the shelves. They have stood that way for years. Emily glanced at the nearest volume. Then they have been wrong for years. For the briefest moment, something changed in his eyes. Not amusement exactly. More like surprise at remembering it existed. He stepped aside. You speak boldly for someone on her first evening. Emily placed the books carefully on the table. I speak more quietly when people leave enough space for me to work. Silence followed. Then Mrs. Whitaker appeared in the doorway and froze. Miss Carter, she said carefully. You are addressing His Grace, the Duke of Whitmore. Emily turned back to Ethan. Anyone else might have stumbled over an apology. She simply dipped her head. Then I am glad I did not ask him to carry the books. Ethan stared at her. Emily returned to her work. And for the first time in years, someone had entered Whitmore Hall without treating its master like a title, a tragedy, or a man already halfway buried. By the end of her first week at Whitmore Hall, Emily had learned that Ethan Whitmore was not a cruel man. Cruelty required a kind of interest in other people, and the Duke seemed determined to feel as little as possible. He gave orders without raising his voice, corrected mistakes without humiliation, and thanked servants with the same measured formality he used when addressing visiting landowners. Yet there was something more unsettling than anger in the way he moved through his own home. He seemed like a guest who had stayed too long in rooms that belonged to someone else. Emily noticed it most clearly in the library. Every evening, shortly after 8, Ethan entered alone and took the same leather chair beside the fireplace. He rarely read for pleasure. Instead, he worked through estate reports until the candles burned low, then unlocked the narrow drawer of his writing desk and removed an old silver pocket watch. He never opened it. He merely held it for several moments before putting it away again. Emily pretended not to notice. She had learned long ago that dignity often depended on allowing people to keep the secrets they were not ready to surrender. But Whitmore Hall itself was less discreet. The house spoke of the man Ethan had once been everywhere Emily looked. Beneath a linen covering in the music room stood a grand piano, its polished wood untouched by dust only where someone still cleaned it faithfully. In a locked cabinet were programs from winter concerts and summer dances. One afternoon, while cataloging old correspondence, Emily discovered invitations written 10 years earlier in Ethan's own hand. The language startled her. Warm, playful, almost mischievous. One letter invited a neighboring family to dinner and promised that his younger brother Daniel would attempt to sing, though Ethan offered no guarantee that the windows would survive. Emily read the sentence twice. The man who had written it seemed impossible to reconcile with the silent figure who now passed her in the corridors. That evening, she found Mrs. Whitaker overseeing the closing of the drawing-room shutters. Was His Grace always so serious? Emily asked. The housekeeper's hands paused on the heavy curtain. No, nothing more came. Emily waited. Mrs. Whitaker finally sighed. When the Duke was younger, this house was rarely quiet. He and Mr. Daniel were forever arguing, laughing, racing horses across the south fields, bringing mud into rooms where mud had no business being. His Grace once filled the fountain with apples because Daniel claimed it could not be done. Emily tried to imagine Ethan doing anything so ridiculous. Who won? No one. The gardener threatened to resign. A small smile touched Mrs. Whitaker's face, then vanished. That was another life. Later that night, Emily crossed the upper gallery carrying a stack of ledgers and saw Ethan standing alone before a portrait she had not noticed before. Two young men stood together beneath a summer sky. One was unmistakably Ethan, perhaps 20 years younger, his expression open and bright. Beside him stood a fair-haired young man with one hand resting casually on Ethan's shoulder. Daniel. Ethan did not know Emily was there. His face had lost its usual control. Not grief exactly. Something heavier. Guilt. Then he whispered into the darkened gallery. I should have believed you. Emily stopped breathing. Ethan turned. The mask returned instantly. His gaze fell upon the ledgers in her arms. You heard nothing, Miss Carter. Emily met his eyes. Then there is nothing for me to repeat. For several seconds, neither moved. Ethan looked at her as though kindness without pity were a language he had forgotten how to understand. Then he walked away, leaving Emily alone beneath the portrait of two brothers who had once known how to laugh together. For 10 years, Ethan had trained himself to remember that winter as a sequence of facts rather than feelings. Snow began before sunset. Daniel arrived at the library shortly after 9. The fire burned low. A letter lay open on the desk. Their voices rose. Daniel left. By morning, he was dead. Facts were safer than memory because facts did not accuse. Yet after Emily found him beneath the portrait, the past refused to remain orderly. That night, Ethan sat alone beside the library fire with Daniel's silver pocket watch resting in his palm. The case was scratched near the hinge. He had known every mark on it for years. Daniel had carried it everywhere, usually forgetting to wind it, then blaming time itself when he arrived late. Once, long before grief had turned such memories cruel, Ethan had laughed so hard at that excuse that Daniel threw a cushion at his head. Ethan closed his fingers around the watch. The sound of that old laughter returned to him more clearly than he wanted. Daniel had been 26 that final winter, restless, loyal, and incapable of leaving a mystery alone. For weeks he had insisted that something was wrong in the estate accounts. Payments appeared twice. Tenant repairs were charged, but never completed. Money vanished through respectable names and tidy signatures. Ethan had dismissed it as carelessness. Their uncle, Charles Whitmore, had managed portions of the family business for years and enjoyed unquestioned trust. Daniel did not share it. On the last evening, he came into the library carrying a packet of papers beneath his coat. His cheeks were red from the cold, his hair wet with melting snow, but his eyes held the fierce certainty Ethan had always found both admirable and exhausting. You need to look at these tonight, Daniel said. Ethan barely glanced up from his correspondence. Tomorrow. There may not be time tomorrow. That sentence still lived inside him. Ethan had been tired, irritated, and already angry from another dispute concerning the estate. You have said that 3 times this month. Daniel placed the papers on the desk. Because 3 times you refused to listen. Ethan finally looked at him. And what would you have me believe? That our own family has spent years stealing from us without anyone noticing except you. I would have you believe me. Silence followed. Daniel was not pleading. That made it worse. Ethan remembered leaning back in his chair, the absurdity of it all pressing against his patience. Then he laughed. One short, dismissive laugh. Daniel, you have frightened yourself over columns of ink. Daniel stared at him as though the laugh had wounded something deeper than the words. You think I am a fool. Ethan, prideful and tired, did not answer quickly enough. Daniel gathered the papers. Very well. I will bring you proof. Ethan should have stopped him. Instead he said, then go. Perhaps when you return, we can discuss something real. Daniel paused at the door. For a moment, Ethan believed he would turn back. He did not. The next morning, the household woke before dawn to news that Daniel's carriage had never reached the neighboring village. By noon, they knew he would not be coming home. Ethan had not laughed since. To others, it seemed like grief. Only Ethan knew the truth. The last laughter Daniel heard from his brother had not been joy. It had been disbelief. And every time Ethan felt even the faintest warmth rise in his chest, he remembered Daniel standing by that library door, asking for one simple thing. Believe me, Emily did not set out to change Whitmore Hall. She simply had no talent for pretending that lifeless things were dignified because they were expensive. On her 9th morning, she opened the library curtains before Mrs. Whittaker arrived and let pale sunlight spill across shelves that had lived in shadow for years. On the 10th, she moved a dying rosemary plant from a cold corridor to the kitchen window and informed the cook that even herbs deserved a fair chance. 2 days later, she discovered a thin gray cat hiding beneath a bench in the glass house and began leaving a saucer of milk there each afternoon. None of these things seemed important. Ethan noticed everyone. He noticed that the library smelled less of dust. He noticed that the gardener's youngest daughter had been given permission to borrow an old book of fairy tales. He noticed that servants had begun speaking a little more freely when Emily was nearby. Most of all, he noticed her voice. Emily never filled silence merely because it existed. She spoke when she had something to say, and what she said was often so plainly sincere that Ethan found himself caught off guard. One afternoon, he entered the East Gallery and found her standing beneath the enormous portrait of Sir Reginald Whitmore, the same ancestor whose painted expression seemed permanently offended by humanity. Emily was holding a feather duster and studying him with narrowed eyes. "Is there a problem?" Ethan asked. Emily turned. "I am deciding whether he disapproves of me personally or whether that is simply his face." Ethan looked at the portrait. "He died nearly a century ago. Then I suppose I am safe." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Emily saw it. Ethan saw that she saw it. The expression vanished instantly. "You should finish your work." "I was attempting to." He walked away before she could say anything more, irritated less by her than by the strange warmth gathering beneath his ribs. Later that evening, he heard laughter from the servants' corridor. Emily's laughter. It was not delicate or practiced. It came freely, bright, and surprised, followed by the cook protesting that his biscuits were not crooked, only rustic. Ethan stopped in the darkened passage beyond the doorway. For several seconds, he listened. He could have announced himself. The laughter would have ended at once. Instead, he remained where he was, unseen, while a feeling he had denied for 10 years returned with painful clarity. He missed that sound. Not Emily specifically, he told himself. Laughter, ease, the careless warmth of people who did not believe joy required permission. The realization frightened him. The next morning, he changed his route through the house so he would not pass the library while Emily worked. By afternoon, he found himself there anyway. She was balancing on a small ladder, returning books to a high shelf. "That is unsafe," he said. Emily looked down. "It has 4 legs, Your Grace. That is usually considered an advantage in ladders." Again, that dangerous pressure touched his chest. He turned toward the window before his face betrayed him. "Mrs. Whittaker can assign someone taller." Someone taller put the books in the wrong order. He heard the faintest amusement in her own voice. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief moment. Emily thought he was impatient with her. She could not know that he was fighting something far more unsettling. For the first time in 10 years, grief was no longer the only thing capable of reaching him. And instead of welcoming that change, Ethan began to fear the woman who had caused it without even knowing she had done anything at all. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, written in Lady Beatrice Holloway's elegant hand, and sealed with enough red wax to suggest the matter concerned a treaty rather than dinner. Ethan read it once, then set it aside. He had declined nearly every formal gathering for years, but Lady Beatrice was his late mother's oldest friend, and even he understood that refusing her third invitation in a single season would become its own kind of spectacle. By evening, Whitmore Hall held more voices than Emily had heard since her arrival. Carriages rolled across the gravel drive. Lamps burned in rooms usually left dark. Silver gleamed beneath candlelight. Emily moved quietly between the library and dining room carrying correspondence for Mrs. Whittaker, trying not to look as surprised as she felt by the sudden return of society to the house. Ethan endured it with the expression of a man waiting for weather to pass. He greeted each guest properly, listened when required, and smiled only with his eyes, if at all. Emily noticed that he never relaxed. Even seated at his own table, he appeared prepared to leave at the first excuse. Lady Beatrice, however, seemed determined to prevent that. She was 70, sharp-eyed, heavily jeweled, and entirely unimpressed by dukes. Halfway through dinner, she glanced toward the portrait of Sir Reginald above the fireplace and frowned. "Ethan, I still cannot understand why you keep that dreadful man in the dining room. He has been glaring at me for 20 years. A few guests chuckled politely. Ethan looked at the portrait. He is an ancestor. So are several people I was pleased to outlive. This time the laughter was warmer. Emily, standing near the sideboard with a stack of ledgers Mrs. Whittaker had asked her to deliver after dinner, tried to keep her attention on her work. Lady Beatrice continued. "Honestly, look at him. That expression could sour milk." Without thinking, Emily murmured to Mrs. Whittaker, "He looks like a man who has just discovered the furniture has opinions." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened. Lady Beatrice turned. What was that? Emily froze. Every rule of service she had learned in the past 3 weeks arrived too late. Nothing, my lady. Nonsense. I heard furniture. Several guests looked toward her. Emily felt warmth rise to her face. Across the table, Ethan was watching. Lady Beatrice pointed toward the portrait. What does he look like? Emily glanced helplessly at Mrs. Whitaker, then back at Sir Reginald. Honesty had already betrayed her. There seemed little advantage in abandoning it now. He looks deeply offended that the chairs are not asking permission before being sat upon. Silence held for one beat. Then something broke. Ethan lowered his head. His shoulders moved once. A sound escaped him, quiet at first, then unmistakable. Laughter. Real laughter. Emily stared. Lady Beatrice stared. The entire table fell still, as if someone had extinguished the room's air. Ethan looked almost shocked by himself. For one fleeting second, the severity left his face, and Emily saw the younger man from the old letters, the brother who once filled fountains with apples and teased Daniel about singing badly. Then the color drained from Ethan's expression. The laughter died in his throat. His fingers tightened against the tablecloth. "Excuse me," he said. He rose so quickly his chair scraped the floor and walked from the room without looking at anyone. Emily followed only when Mrs. Whitaker whispered, "Go." She found him at the far end of the west corridor, standing before a locked door with one hand braced against the cold wood. "Your Grace." Ethan did not turn. I laughed. Emily waited. "Yes." His voice became quieter. "You do not understand. Then tell me." For a long moment, nothing moved except candlelight against the stone walls. At last Ethan closed his eyes. "I cannot." Emily did not step closer. She did not offer comfort he had not asked for. She simply remained there. And for the first time in 10 years, Ethan was forced to face the truth he feared most. Laughter had returned, and Daniel had not. The morning after Lady Beatrice's dinner, Whitmore Hall seemed ashamed of having made too much noise. The guest rooms emptied before noon. The silver was returned to locked cabinets, and the corridors settled once more into their old hush. Ethan did not appear at breakfast. He did not enter the library at 8. By afternoon, Emily had begun to wonder whether the sound of his laughter had frightened him back into some deeper silence. She did not seek him out. Instead, she carried on with the inventory Mrs. Whitaker had assigned to the west wing, where winter rain had begun to find its way through a section of damaged roof. Most of the rooms there remained locked, but one narrow storage chamber stood open, the air inside smelling of old wood, dust, and damp paper. Emily moved carefully among covered furniture until she found a wooden box beneath a small writing table. Water had darkened one corner of the lid. When she lifted it, several bundles of letters lay inside, tied with faded blue ribbon. She would have left them untouched if not for the damp spreading through the bottom layer. One envelope had already slipped loose. The handwriting on it was strong and familiar from the old invitations she had catalogued. Daniel Whitmore. Emily hesitated. Then footsteps sounded behind her. "What are you doing?" Ethan's voice was low, but it carried through the room like a door closing. Emily turned. He stood in the entrance, his face pale with anger. "The roof is leaking. I was moving the papers before they were damaged." His gaze fell to the open box. "Those are not household papers." "I know that now." Ethan crossed the room and took the letters from her hands more sharply than usual, then immediately seemed to regret the movement. "You had no right." Emily held his gaze. "You are correct." The simple answer stopped him. No defense. No apology shaped to protect herself. Just truth. Ethan looked down at the letters, and one envelope slipped free, landing near his shoe. The seal had never been broken. His name was written across the front. Ethan froze. Emily bent instinctively, but he said, "Leave it." She did. For several seconds, he only stared. Then he picked it up. "I have never seen this." His voice had changed. The anger was gone. In its place was something far more fragile. He broke the old seal. Emily turned away, giving him privacy, but the silence stretched so long that she finally looked back. Ethan was reading the same lines again and again. "What does it say?" she asked softly. He did not answer at first. Then he read aloud. "Ethan will forgive me by morning. He always does. He laughed because he thinks I have frightened myself over nothing, but I will prove it to him tomorrow, and then he will call me an insufferable fool." Ethan stopped. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Emily felt the meaning before he spoke it. Daniel had not died believing his brother hated him. He had expected reconciliation. He had expected mourning. Ethan lowered himself into the nearest chair as though his strength had quietly left him. "For 10 years," he said, "I thought the last thing he carried from this house was my contempt." Emily did not move closer. It was not. Ethan closed his eyes. No. He looked again at the letter, and something near the bottom caught his attention. A second line had been added in haste. His expression sharpened. "There is more." He read silently, then stood. He named someone. Emily's heart tightened. "Who?" Ethan looked toward the door, toward the quiet house beyond it. "My Uncle Charles." The name landed heavily between them. Daniel had written that Charles's accounts did not merely contain errors. They contained patterns, false repairs, repeated payments, money directed through estates that did not exist. Daniel had been gathering proof. Ethan looked at the damp box, then at the unopened bundles beneath it. Grief gave way to something colder and clearer. "He was right," Ethan whispered. Emily watched the man who had spent 10 years punishing himself begin, for the first time, to ask a different question. Not why Daniel had died believing him, but what Daniel had discovered before he never came home. For the next 2 days, Ethan and Emily worked through Daniel's papers beneath the steady gray light of the library windows. And with every page the past became less like a tragedy shaped by chance, and more like a story someone had carefully arranged to remain misunderstood. The documents were not dramatic. That was what made them convincing. Receipts repeated under different dates. Repairs charged to cottages that tenants swore had never been completed. Payments sent to businesses that existed only as names in Charles Whitmore's private ledger. Daniel had marked each irregularity in neat pencil, leaving questions in the margins and references to letters he intended to collect. Ethan read them with a stillness Emily had come to recognize as dangerous only to himself. He was not angry in the way other men became angry. He grew quieter, more precise. "He showed me the beginning of this," Ethan said late on the second evening. "I laughed because I thought he had mistaken disorder for dishonesty." Emily closed one account book. "You believed someone you trusted. I refused to believe someone who trusted me." The distinction mattered to him. Emily could hear it. She did not soften it with false comfort. "Then believe him now." Ethan looked at her across the desk. Candlelight moved over the tired lines of his face. For 10 years, everyone had tried to release him from guilt by telling him that Daniel's death was not his fault. Emily offered something different. Responsibility without self-destruction. Truth without punishment. Ethan lowered his gaze to the ledger. "There is one person who may remember these payments." The following afternoon, he invited Charles Whitmore to the house. Charles arrived before sunset, dressed in dark blue wool, carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who had spent decades being welcomed wherever his family name opened doors. He greeted Ethan warmly, then noticed Emily beside the account books. His smile thinned. "I was told this concerned family business." "It does," Ethan replied. Lady Beatrice and 2 neighboring landowners had also been asked to attend, along with the estate solicitor. Charles's confidence faltered only slightly when he saw them. Ethan did not accuse him. He simply placed Daniel's records on the long table one by one. Dates, payments, names, letters, questions. Charles dismissed the first discrepancy as clerical error, the second as confusion, the third as Daniel's youthful suspicion. Then Emily produced the final ledger she had found beneath the false bottom of Daniel's box. Charles looked at her as though her presence itself were an insult. "You would allow a servant to interfere in matters she cannot possibly understand." The room chilled. Emily said nothing. She had learned that dignity did not always require defense. Ethan rose slowly. "Miss Carter understood enough to preserve papers my family ignored for 10 years. Charles gave a short, humorless laugh. "And you would take her word over mine?" Ethan's eyes did not leave his uncle's face. "No, I would take the truth from anyone brave enough to speak it." The solicitor opened the ledger. Charles stopped smiling. There would be inquiries, accounts reviewed, property restored, and names cleared through law rather than spectacle. Ethan had no need to humiliate him. The evidence was sufficient. When Charles finally left, Whitmore Hall seemed to exhale. Ethan remained beside the table, one hand resting on Daniel's last letter. Emily approached only as far as the opposite chair. "He was right," Ethan said. Yes. And I should have listened. Emily's voice was gentle but steady. Yes. Ethan looked at her, surprised again by her refusal to lie for kindness. Then she added, But you are listening now. Something in his face gave way. Not laughter. Not yet. Something quieter. Forgiveness had not arrived. But for the first time, Ethan understood that honoring Daniel did not require spending the rest of his life inside the worst night they had ever shared. Spring came quietly to Whitmore Hall. The first change was not in Ethan, but in the house. Curtains that had remained closed for years were drawn back each morning. The music room was opened and aired. Fresh flowers appeared on tables that had once held only dust and silver. Children from the estate were invited to use a corner of the library every Thursday, and their voices carried through corridors where even servants had once spoken in whispers. Mrs. Whitaker pretended to disapprove of the noise, but Emily noticed that she always ordered extra biscuits on those afternoons. Ethan changed more slowly. He still worked too late. He still paused sometimes before Daniel's portrait. But the silver pocket watch no longer disappeared into a locked drawer. It rested beside his papers, not as a punishment, but as a memory. Charles Whitmore's accounts had been turned over to the proper authorities. The missing funds were being traced, and Daniel's name had finally been cleared of every doubt that had gathered around his final investigation. Yet the greatest change came on a bright morning in April, when Emily placed a neatly folded letter on Ethan's desk. He looked at it, then at her. What is this? My notice. The word struck him with surprising force. You are leaving? Emily folded her hands before her. The library records are complete. Mrs. Whitaker no longer needs assistance with the accounts. There is a position available in Boston with a private family. It is respectable work. Ethan had faced accusations, loss, and years of silence with more composure than he possessed in that moment. Every selfish instinct told him to order her to stay. He was a duke. He could raise her wages, invent responsibilities, make departure inconvenient. Instead, he remembered what she had given him from the beginning. Honesty without obligation. Is that what you want? He asked. Emily hesitated. I want a life where I am not required to remain somewhere simply because someone has been kind to me. Ethan nodded, though the answer hurt. Then you should never stay from gratitude. She studied him carefully. And if I go, then I will be grateful you came. Silence stretched between them, but it was no longer the dead silence Whitmore Hall had known before her arrival. This one was full of things neither wished to say poorly. Emily looked toward the window, where sunlight lay across the restored gardens. You realize, of course, that the library will become unbearable again without proper supervision. Ethan almost smiled. Mrs. Whitaker has supervised it for 20 years. Exactly my concern. He looked at her. Emily looked back, entirely serious. Yesterday, I found a history of maritime trade between 2 volumes of poetry. Civilization is clearly collapsing. Ethan laughed. It came easily this time, warm and unguarded, filling the room without fear following behind it. Emily's expression softened, and then she laughed too. Ethan did not stop himself. He did not glance toward Daniel's portrait for permission. He simply allowed the sound to exist. When the laughter faded, he said, Stay if staying would make you happy. Not because I need saving. Not because this house does. Stay because you choose it. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then I suppose Boston will have to survive without me. Outside, the spring wind moved through newly opened windows, carrying children's voices up from the garden. Ethan reached for Daniel's pocket watch and closed his hand around it gently. For years, he had believed love for the dead required loyalty to sorrow. Emily had taught him something kinder. Memory did not demand silence. Grief did not forbid joy. And sometimes healing was not forgetting the people we had lost, but finally allowing ourselves to live without apologizing to them.